what will be built into this. Starting with bullying and morality. So, I mean, if you happen to study just a little moral philosophy, you will quite soon realize that the only thing when it comes to morality, which is actually a core thing in moral philosophy, the only thing that moral philosophies can agree upon is that they can't agree upon what morality is. So there are different normative ethical traditions, such as deontological ethics, consequentialism, ethics of care, virtue ethics, and so on. And there is a huge, ongoing, endless debate between these traditions as well as within them. So, despite this diversity in moral philosophy, I will be a bit bold by saying that bullying is an obvious moral transgression. I mean, what is bullying about? It is about repeatedly doing harm to someone in a less powerful situation. It is not okay. And you don't need to be a moral philosopher to come to that conclusion. Research that we have conducted in Sweden has consistently shown that children themselves judge bullying as a severe transgression and wrong, independent of school rules, by referring to the harm it causes the victim. Still, it takes place in schools all around the world. So regular kids can become bullies, or they can take the bully's side as assistants or reinforcers due to various different reasons and factors. But the question remains, how the heck can they do all these things if they in general condemn bullying? And here we bump into a case of the gap between attitudes and behavior, or the gap between moral standards and actions. And those of you in the audience who happens to know me, you do not need to be a rocket scientist to predict what concept I will introduce next. I'm so sorry to be that, super predictable. It's almost embarrassing. Well, it reminds me actually of an incident that happens, some years ago now, in another WABF conference. And this was the first time I met a very dear friend of mine, Chloe Tolmachev, and she's also here at the conference. And back then she told me that she used to call me or refer to me as the moral disengagement guy. And I really don't know if that is a good thing or a bad thing to be called. Anyway, Chloe is an awesome researcher and a great friend. So, moral disengagement. Within his social cognitive theoretical framework, Albert Bandura introduced the concept of moral disengagement, which might help us, at least in part, to explain and understand the moral gap between attitudes and behavior that goes on in bullying. This is not a theory of everything. This is just one piece of the puzzle. Here's a kind of description of moral disengagement. Individual or social psychological processes that enable people to convince themselves that moral standards do not apply to them in a particular situation or activity, allowing them to behave in ways they normally would consider wrong, such as harming others without feeling guilty or ashamed. And Bandura proposed different mechanisms of moral disengagement: moral justification, euphemistic labeling, advantageous comparison, displacement of responsibility, diffusion of responsibility, distorting the consequences, dehumanization, and blaming the victim. So, let's have a look about the research on moral disengagement and bullying. What do we know from the research? Well, as compared with their peers, Children and adolescents who display higher moral disengagement are more inclined to engage in bullying perpetration. At least 3 meta-analyses have shown that when looking at studies and doing this kind of analysis. We have repeatedly confirmed the link between moral disengagement and bullying among students in several studies. This is really a robust pattern. However, most of the studies are cross-sectional. So less research has investigated the relationship between moral disengagement and bullying over time. And we need to do more longitudinal studies to better understand and examine the directionality, including the possible bidirectionality between these variables. There is a number of longitudinal studies that is growing, but we need to do more. And I will just give you 2 examples from studies from our team or lab. The first one is a short-term longitudinal study in which more than 1,300 students completed a survey in 4th grade, in which they are around 10, 11 years old in Sweden, and then 1 year later in 5th grade. And here are the findings. So this is also what we expected. As you can see, both variables predicted themselves over time. What we also found was that bullying and perpetration at time 1 positively predicted moral disengagement at time 2, even when controlling for moral disengagement at time 1. We also found that moral disengagement at time 1 positively predicted bullying perpetration at time 2 when controlling for bullying perpetration at time 1. We expanded this project and we conducted a 3-year longitudinal study, and here we delimited our focus to verbal bullying because in school, verbal bullying is the most common form of bullying according to some national reports in Sweden as well as some international studies and across ages. So therefore we focus on that one. In this study, more than 2,400 students participated. The analysis was based on self-report survey data. The study included 4 waves, and we followed students from grade 4 to grade 7. And here are the findings. Results of a multi-level growth model show that verbal bullying sadly increased over time. We also found that the verbal bullying trajectories of participants with higher levels of moral disengagement were higher and steeper, indicating that these students scored higher on verbal bullying in general and increased more in verbal bullying over time compared to students with lower levels of moral disengagement. And we also found that variations around one's own mean of moral disengagement over time was also significantly associated with concurrent changes in verbal bullying. So to put it very simply, this study shows that moral disengagement is indeed a risk factor when it comes to verbal bullying perpetration. We can say that very simply that moral disengagement was positively associated with verbal bullying behavior across these grades. School bullying doesn't happen in a social vacuum. It is a social phenomenon. It is embedded in a social context where peers mostly are there, they are present as bystanders. That has been found, for example, in the seminal work of Wendy Craig and Deborah Pepler in their observation studies in Canada from the 1990s. So this is really something to consider, the bystanders. And in line with Joshua Polanin and Dorothy Espelage and colleagues from the meta-analysis from 2012, we simply define a bystander as any student who witnesses a bullying incident. And when they do that, they can respond to it in three main different ways. They could take the bully side, what we sometimes call pro-bullying, and it could be either as an assistant or as a reinforcer. They could also remain passive, trying to stay outside, trying to not get involved, and we call that, either we call it passive bystanding or the outsider role or outsider behavior. Or they could act as defenders, trying to help, support, and defend the victims. But why is it of interest to do research about bystanders of school bullying? There are different reasons for doing that. One of them is that research conducted by Christina Salmivalli and colleagues around her has shown that bullying is more prevalent in classrooms or in school classes in which it is more common that students as bystanders take the bully side, reinforce bullying and fail to act as defenders, while bullying prevalence is lower in classrooms or school classes in which the more common way of acting as a bystander is to defend the victim. So these studies suggest that bystanders matters in the bullying situation, and increasing our understanding of individual and contextual factors that are associated with different bystander behaviors are therefore very, very important. Research on moral disengagement and bystander behaviors. So what is the link according to research? What we can see is that children and adolescents with higher moral disengagement are more inclined to take the bully side and reinforce peer aggression, less inclined to defend the victim. And considering the first one, the positive association between moral disengagement and pro-bullying, that is the stronger link. When it comes to the negative association between moral disengagement and defending, that link is weaker, but still it's there. However, only a few studies have investigated the relationship between moral disengagement and passive bystanding, and the findings are inconsistent. There are some studies showing a positive association, other studies showing a negative associations, and there are also research findings showing no significant association at all. So here is something we need to do more about. We really need to dig into that. In order to better understand bystander behaviors, we can also include other components. And if we go back to the social cognitive theory formulated by Bandura, another concept from that theory is self-efficacy. And when it comes to doing research about bystanders in school bullying or peer aggression situations, defender or defending self-efficacy is a helpful concept. It could be defined as the belief in one's capacities to successfully intervene in peer aggression to defend a victim. Helping or defending a victimized peer in a bullying situation can be perceived by bystanders as a quite risky project. Fear has been found to be a common reason for not intervening in qualitative interview studies with children and adolescents. For example, the work of Joachim Strindberg or the work of Camilla Forsberg. So without a strong belief in one's ability to successfully intervene, carrying out such behavior would probably be inhibited. In line with that, and in line with the social cognitive theory, research has also shown that defender self-efficacy among the kids is positively associated with defending and negatively associated with passive bystanding. So this is an important component in addition to moral disengagement if you would like to understand the moral agency of being a bystander. So back to the tricky findings when it comes to moral disengagement and passive bystanding. Inspired by Obermann's distinction of two forms of passive bystanding. One is unconcerned bystanders, those who remain passive without feeling troubled or responsible. And then we have guilty bystanders, those who also remain passive but believe that they should help the victim but fail to take action. So we conducted a study. We developed a short questionnaire based on these concepts, and more than 1,100 students from grades 4 to 6 participated here. And this is the findings. So we put in both moral disengagement and defender self-efficacy in this model. So as you can see, we can start with defender self-efficacy. Defender self-efficacy was positively associated with defending. And it was negatively associated with both forms of passive bystanding. While moral disengagement was, as we expected, negatively but weakly associated with defending, and now the new step we want to understand, it was also negatively but weakly associated with guilty bystanding, which kind of makes sense. I mean, if you, as a bystander, remain passive and you feel guilt of being passive, that says something about that moral disengagement hasn't kicked in, right? And you can see finally that moral disengagement was positively and more strongly associated with unconcerned bystanding, which also makes sense. So a kid who happens to be a bystander and remain passive and think that it's not my problem, I'm not bothered, it's not my responsibility, yeah, that might indicate that moral disengagement has been activated. Even though moral disengagement in most studies has been examined at the individual level as individual variable, the social cognitive theory emphasizes that human behavior is produced and regulated by a complex and continual interplay between individual and contextual factors. The theory also states that moral disengagement can be operated at the individual level, but also at the group level or the collective level. There is the concept of collective moral disengagement. In line with this, some researchers have started to investigate whether moral disengagement as a group-level property is associated with bullying. Mostly, the focus has been on the classroom level. Based on Bandura's concept of collective moral disengagement, Gianluca Gini, Tiziana Pozzoli, and Shelley Heimel developed this idea of classroom collective moral disengagement, and they mean that that is the classroom aggregation of student perceptions of the degree to which moral disengagement is shared by the classroom members. And there are still quite few studies focusing on this concept, but I will give you a very brief review of these studies, what we in general have found. So, collective moral disengagement at the classroom level has been linked to aggression, bullying perpetration, bullying victimization, pro-bullying bystander behavior, taking the bully side as a bystander, passive bystanding, and less defending. There is still few studies, but it shows its potential. This seems to be quite important to consider and address in bullying prevention. Another concept from the social cognitive theory is collective efficacy. And based on that concept, Kirsten Barcia and Kai Bassey, they developed the idea of collective efficacy to stop peer aggression, which can be defined as shared beliefs among students in the ability of students and teachers to work together to stop peer aggression in their school. And I think this is a really cool concept, Because what it says is that we can be strong together. You do not need to be the single bystander who is acting. We can together do something. We can be strong together. They developed a scale about this concept, and they tested it, but at the individual level in a smaller study. And what they found was that individually perceived collective efficacy to stop peer aggression predicted less aggression and greater defending. But because I think this is a very cool and potential concept, we would like to study that also at the classroom level as a group level property, and we have done that. So we used their scale, we adapted it a little to make sure that the students rated their own classroom member group or their own school class. And we found that students in classrooms with high collective efficacy to stop peer aggression were as bystanders less likely to remain passive, reinforce the bullying, and more likely to defend victims, in line with the social cognitive theory about collective efficacy. In a one-year longitudinal study, we also found that an increase of classroom-level collective efficacy to stop peer aggression was associated with a decrease of bullying behavior over 1 year. So let's move on to the teacher. Yeah, I know this is an AI-produced image, and I asked the program, can you please create an image in which we have a nice teacher and within a nice classroom? And I'm not sure if it's just about me kind of responding to an old-fashioned projective test, but isn't it something vague creepiness lurking in this image? I mean, look at the students, they almost like brainwashed. And look at the teacher, the smile and the gaze. Whoa, I do not want to be a student in this classroom. But maybe it's just me who watched too many American horror movies as a teenager. I don't know. Anyway, as the primary adult authority, teachers are role models and could, through their relationships with the students, their classroom management and teaching style, have a credible impact on the social climate, norms, relationships, behaviors in their classroom group of students. One dimension of this that we have been interested in is the quality of student-teacher relationships. And this is a classic one. We can talk about positive or close student-teacher relationships characterized by warmth, trust, care, support, and open communication. And we can also talk about negative or conflictual student-teacher relationships as power struggle, constant conflicts, emotional withdrawal, and lack of warmth and support and trust. So there has been a lot of research looking at this in relation to many outcomes, both academic achievement, academic engagement, the sense of school belonging, and so on. But of interest for this conference is, of course, the relationship when it comes to bullying. And what has been found is that students who have a more positive and warm, supportive relationships with their teachers are less inclined to be involved in bullying, while students who have a more negative or conflictual student-teacher relationship, they are more inclined to be involved in bullying. And we have also studied this because it's so important to look more at. So let me give you a short review also here about what we have found. In one study, we found that positive student-teacher relationships were associated with a lower probability of being a bully victim, or a victim. In that way, we support previous research. Students who perceived greater teacher support were less peer victimized. Warm or close student-teacher relationships were positively associated with defending victims and with autonomous motivation to defend victims. So they were more self-determined to act as defenders. And we have also found that negative or conflictual student-teacher relationships were linked to greater bullying victimization. Most of these studies that have been conducted have been at the individual level, like the student-teacher dyad. So the student level or the individual level. We conducted one study in which we also included the classroom level, and we found in that study that students belonging to classrooms where teachers were rated as more caring, fair, and respectful were less likely to be peer victimized. And this is actually a dimension of this, authoritative teachers. This is really a hard word to say, authoritative, particularly if you like me, are from Sweden, authoritative. I try my best. So this actually has its roots in the seminal work of Diana Baumbrand and her research on parenting and parenting styles. Decades later, it became translated into the school context. So when we talk about authoritative teachers, they are the teachers who combine or are high in both support or responsiveness, warmth, care, and respect for students' needs and opinions, and high on structure or demandingness. Expectations and rules are clear, consistently enforced, and fairly applied. Discipline is strict but fair, not arbitrary. Also a hard word to say in Sweden. Or harsh. And this has been studied by many great researchers like Erling Roland, Anne Gregory, Dewey Cornell, and Francis Wang, to mention some of those. And I found fascinating super large-scale studies conducted in US, conducted by Dewey Cornell and others, looking at that in school level and comparing school. They have the concept of authoritative school climate or authoritative schools. And what they have found is that students in more authoritative schools are less likely to bully others, be a target of bullying or peer victimization, witness peer victimization, engage in violent or aggressive behavior, be a target of sexual harassment. This seems to be a really important component at the whole school level when it comes to bullying prevention. So let's go back to Sweden, my home country. So in Sweden, students usually remain in a single group of 15 to 30 peers through the upper elementary school, from grade 4 to grade 6, for the full school day or most of the lessons. And this is important, during these 3 years, they have the same main class teacher and a few additional teachers responsible for them. So this gives us an opportunity to examine authoritative teaching at the classroom level. And we have started to do that. And what have we found so far? Well, students belonging to classrooms with more authoritative teachers were less likely to be targets of school or bullying, bully others, act as reinforcers and passive bystanders when witnessing bullying, and more likely to act as defenders when witnessing bullying. However, this is only 3 studies so far. So, if you are young researchers and you would like to find new frontiers, fields that are really understudied, let me give you some advice. We have classroom collective moral disengagement, very few studies, very important to study. we have collective efficacy to stop peer aggression. Very, very few studies, very important to learn more about. And we have authoritative teaching at the classroom level. So there you go. I would like to see more research about all these things. And this is the last part of the keynote, the class climate. I know that this could be a bit confusing concept, so I need to clarify it a bit. By doing that, I have to start with the term class or school class. When I say school class or when I say class, I don't refer to a specific lesson or course that students attend. Here I mean a group of students who are taught together and are together for the entire school day or for the majority of their lessons. In Swedish we say skolklass or class, quite similar to school class or class. So that is what I mean when I say class climate. So class climate can be defined as the quality of collective interactions and relationships among students within the same school class, the social and emotional atmosphere within the student unit. So it's important to see that this is something else than classroom climate. Classroom climate also usually include the teacher and the teacher-student relationships and interactions. It also usually includes things like classroom rules, classroom routines, the order in the classroom, and is also located to the physical classroom. While class climate is located to the student unit, the school class, that could be in the physical classroom, but could also be in other settings in the school, such as the playground or the corridor and so on. And it is within this unit that students spend most of their school days. So it's a very important social context to be in and be a part of. So we have conducted some studies in which we have tried to investigate this concept of the class climate. So I will give you a brief overview also here, what we have found. So students belonging to school classes with a more positive class climate were less likely to be a bully victim, or a victim of school bullying. Be a target of peer victimization, be a victim of school bullying 6 months later, and more likely to act as defenders when witnessing bullying. So here is another topic if you are a young researcher eager to dig into a new field that is understudied, the class climate. Please do that. We really need to know more about these contextual components of the school. I will end this presentation with a final example of a study that we have conducted, and this is not yet published, so it is in progress. So this is also a short-term longitudinal study. In this study, we have more than 1,300 students from 106 classrooms. And the data that we collect are based on self-report survey. It includes here 2 waves. First, when the students are in the 5th grade, and we follow them to the 6th grade. So 1 wave each year. And the variables that we are trying to measure is bullying perpetration, conflictual student-teacher relationships, and class climate. And this is a bit special. Usually when researchers are measuring class climate or classroom climate or school climate and do that through student surveys, usually we aggregated the data to that level, the classroom level or the school level. Here, we included two variables. We have both a between-class variable, in other words, a class-level variable, aggregated to the class mean, the traditional way of measuring it. But we also included a within-class variable, an individual-level variable centered around the class mean, so comparing to the other classmates, my perception of the class climate. And here are the findings. So when controlling for gender, immigrant background, and bullying perpetration at the 5th grade, we found that kids who had a more conflictual student-teacher relationships at the 5th grade tended to be more inclined to bully others in the 6th grade. So it predicted bullying perpetration. We also found that both within class climate and between class climate, both these variables were negatively associated with bullying perpetration 1 year later, indicating the protective factor of a good class climate. And also a cross-level interaction, indicating that those who belong to the classes with the most negative class climates, and in addition to that are those who have the most negative perception of the class climate, they were those who was at the highest risk of engaging in bullying 1 year later. So let's say something about so-called take-home messages. Schools' efforts in bullying prevention should consider following components. First of all, teach students to recognize and say no to moral disengagement mechanisms in themselves and others. I mean, moral disengagement is really a sly crock, you know? It's something that is most efficient when we are not aware of it, when we just believe in it. So we need to expose it. We need to be aware of the mechanisms and also to be more skillful in recognizing when it is present. Second, promote a classroom collective efficacy to stop peer aggression. As I say, I think this is a really cool concept that really could be helpful. It's a beautiful potential inside this kind of construct, and we really need to do more research on that one. Establish and maintain positive, warm, and supportive student-teacher relationships and avoid getting stuck in negative ones. The first is obviously a protective factor, and the second is a clear risk factor. And much more of this. Teachers who are warm, caring, respectful, and responsive in their interactions with students, while also being clear adults who set boundaries, maintain order, and create a safe and supportive learning environment together with students. In other words, more of teachers who act as authoritative teachers, right? And promote a positive class climate. The importance of having teachers who really use their classroom management, who take the leadership to promote a positive group development, including a positive, caring, supportive class climate with a good cohesion. So you think it's over? Not really, because as a good TV show, you need to have some cliffhangers. And I have some cliffhangers. I will just say something, what is going on at Linköping University. And this is, of course, just a selection. So, and I will talk about a project that are funded. So we will continue our study on class climate, authoritative teaching, student-teacher relationship quality, and bullying. And this is in collaboration with colleagues at University of Gävle and University of Gothenburg. We have also a project on hate speech and young minorities in schools. Thomas Jungert at Lund University is the principal investigator, and he collaborates with us at Linköping University. It's really important stuff. Defending bullied peers, a longitudinal study of peer defending as a multidimensional construct. This is really at the start. So it's Björn Sjögren, who is the principal investigator, and together with me and Lina Wernström and Magnus Loftsson, who will be a part of that, assigned to be a half-time Ph.D. student, together with Marlene Bjerrehed at University of Kristianstad, friends, and Wendy Craig at Queen's University. This is really awesome. LGBTQI+ youth lived experiences of homophobic bullying in school, with Camilla Forsberg and Paul Horton doing that study. School safety and unsafety, children's perspective. So here is Lael Wildgren and myself, together with Ylva Bjerrehed from University of Gothenburg. And an ethnographic study on sexual harassment at school. It's mainly done at the university at Gothenburg, but I will be a small part of this awesome project. And finally, a longitudinal study on mental health, moral distress, and bystander behaviors of school bullying. Here, Björn Sjögren, once again, is the main principal investigator, and I will be a part of that as well. So, you know, I can see the ticking down, the seconds here. So the time is flying away. Also, this presentation, the keynote. So, it's time for the moral disengagement guy to say, that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Thornberg, for your very, very inspiring and forward-looking keynote. We hope that this book will be a reminder of your time here and of the inspiration you've shared with us during this conference. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you very much.